It was really good for me to meet them because I really admired them from the recording work that they'd done. They're definitely from the same school I come from.
The truth about Jimmy Page is finally coming out. For 50 years, he hid behind his guitar genius. But the secrets are too big to stay buried. Stories about what really happened on those Led Zeppelin tours. The relationships that should never have existed. The behavior that shocked even rock stars. Hotel rooms had to be locked from the outside. Young girls were kept hidden. Now at 81, Page is facing the consequences. The music world is in shock because this isn't the Jimmy Page they thought they knew. Jimmy Page was born on January 9, 1944 in Middlesex during the middle of World War II. His father worked as an industrial personnel manager at a plastic coatings plant, and his mother was a doctor's secretary. The family lived a stable middle-class life. He went to Epsom County Pound Lane Primary School and later Ewell County Secondary School. It was a safe, ordinary upbringing, and no one could have guessed that this boy would one day help create some of the loudest and most influential rock music ever recorded. Everything changed when he was 12. In their Miles Road home, Jimmy found a Spanish guitar. Nobody knew where it came from or who had left it there, but it sparked something in him. He became obsessed with Elvis Presley and especially the guitarists who played with him like Scotty Moore and James Burton. He also admired Lonnie Donegan, Little Richard, and Jerry Lee Lewis. Jimmy taught himself to play by listening to records and reading manuals. He traced rockabilly music back to its blues roots, discovering legends like Sleepy John Estes, Arthur Big Boy, Crudup, Muddy Waters, and Howlin' Wolf. Years later, he wrote about visiting Elvis's hometown in Tupelo, saying it took Elvis's genius to blend those influences and change the world. This was more than a hobby for Jimmy. It was the beginning of the musical vision that would define his life. In April 1958, a fresh-faced Jimmy appeared on the BBC's All You Own as part of the J.G. Skiffle Group. He was only 13 when the segment was filmed. On air, he spoke about wanting to be a musician, but also about his interest in finding a cure for cancer if it wasn't discovered by the time he grew up. The skiffle craze was huge in Britain then, and this TV moment showed him performing for a national audience for the first time. It was a small step, but it planted the idea that music could take him places far beyond his school in Westview. As a teenager, Jimmy faced a choice. His parents hoped he would take the safer path in science while he was being pulled deeper into music. He studied at Sutton Art College, but spent most of his time playing in clubs and on street corners. By 1963, when he was 19, he decided to give his life to music. He admitted he didn't know if he would succeed, but he knew he wanted to be part of it. By the mid-1960s, Jimmy was one of London's busiest session guitarists, sometimes working 3 recording sessions a day, 6 days a week. He could play rockabilly, blues, acoustic guitar, and even harmonica. Producers loved him because he could adapt to anything instantly. Other musicians called him Lil Jim P to tell him apart from Big Jim Sullivan. This constant work not only made him money, but also taught him everything about recording and producing music, skills that would become crucial later. Jimmy was often hired as an insurance guitarist in case a band's own guitarist couldn't finish a recording. He played on early tracks by the Kinks and The Who, sometimes uncredited. For The Who's I Can't Explain, Pete Townshend was reluctant to let him play, but Jimmy still appeared on the B-side Bald-Headed Woman. This behind-the-scenes role meant that his guitar was on many famous records without most people knowing. In August 1964, at just 20, Jimmy played guitar during the recording of Shirley Bassey's Goldfinger theme at ABI Road Studio One. He watched her nail the song in one take only to collapse after holding the final note for so long. This was also the first time he worked with John Paul Jones, who would later join Led Zeppelin. There's debate over whether Jimmy played on the main version or just the instrumental, but the session linked him to one of the most famous film themes in history. Through the 1960s, Jimmy played on huge hits like Marianne Faithfull's As Days Go By, Petula Clark's Downtown, Donovan's Sunshine Superman, and Joe Cocker's With a Little Help from My Friends. He worked with the Rolling Stones, Them, and many others. In the studio world, secrecy was everything. Musicians didn't talk about which songs they played on, and Jimmy often didn't know who would walk into the session until they arrived. These years gave him a deep understanding of the industry and the connections to eventually form one of the biggest bands in rock history. When Jimmy Page joined the Yardbirds in June 1966, he was first brought in to play bass. That didn't last long. Within weeks, he was sharing lead guitar duties with Jeff Beck, creating one of the most explosive guitar pairings rock had ever seen. Their sound hit its peak with Happenings 10 years time ago, recorded in July and September 1966. The two guitars weaved together in ways no one else had tried. But the magic was unpredictable. Page later admitted that while some nights were perfect, others fell apart when the parts didn't sync. He'd be sticking to the plan while Beck veered somewhere else entirely. That same year, the band found themselves on a film set rather than a stage. Michelangelo Antoni had invited them to appear in his award-winning movie Blow Up. In one scene, Beck smashes his guitar after an amp blows, echoing Pete Townshend's famous onstage destruction. The Who had turned down the role, so the Yardbirds took it. Page later recalled how surreal it was to see the finished film. They hadn't been invited to any premieres and ended up queuing like everyone else to watch themselves on screen. Still, the scene became one of the rare filmed moments where audiences could actually witness the Beck and Page guitar partnership. By 1968, constant touring had worn the Yardbirds down. Jim McCarty and Keith Ralph, who had been there since 1963, were exhausted. They wanted to slow down and explore more acoustic folk-inspired music, while Page still wanted to push the band into heavier rock. Their final U.S. shows came at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles on May 31st and June 1st, followed by June 4th and 5 performances in Alabama. These gigs, later released on a bootleg called Last Rave Up in L.A., captured a band on the edge. On June 12th, they officially announced McCarty and Ralph's departures. The very last Yardbirds show took place on July 7th, 1968 in Luton, Bedfordshire. Before that chapter closed, Page had dreamed up something huge. He imagined a supergroup with himself and Beck on guitars, Keith Moon on drums, John Entwistle on bass, and Steve Winwood or Steve Merritt singing. The idea wasn't just a fantasy. Page, Beck, and Moon had already played together in 1966 on Beck's Bolero alongside future Zeppelin bassist John Paul Jones. But contracts, schedules, and personal issues killed the plan. Moon was unpredictable. The Who was busy, and Beck was off to build his solo career. That dream band never happened. But the failure pushed Page toward creating Led Zeppelin instead. When McCarty and Ralph left, Page and bassist Chris Dreja still had Yardbird shows under contract. They couldn't cancel without risking legal trouble. Page had to put together a new band quickly and even toured Denmark and Sweden under names like the Yardbirds featuring Jimmy Page. This scramble led him to recruit Robert Plant, John Paul Jones, and John Bonham. On October 25, 1968, the new band played its first official gig as Led Zeppelin at Sir University. They were paid $175s, and Page noted the detail in his appointment book. An unremarkable fee for what became a historic night. Robert Plant almost wasn't in the picture at all. Page's first choice for singer was Terry Reid. A 19-year-old Arthur Franklin had once called one of the only 3 things happening in England alongside the Beatles and the Stones. But Reid was already booked to tour with the Stones in America and didn't want to break the deal. Instead, he recommended Plant and Bonham. That recommendation shaped rock history, though Reid said he never regretted his choice. Led Zeppelin's early rehearsals took place in a converted boathouse along the Thames at Pangbourne. Page had bought it in 1967 for $6,000 from his savings as a session guitarist. The place had hardwood floors, a riverside view, and perfect acoustics for a band that blended blues, psychedelic, and hard rock. It was here that Page first played the riff A Whole Lot of Love to the Others, sparking instant excitement. Plant's life had changed dramatically in those months. Before joining, he had been homeless for over a year, living out of a suitcase while playing in small local bands. Joining Zeppelin meant going from near poverty to touring Scandinavia and flying internationally within weeks. The contrast stayed with him, later inspiring his work with homeless charities in Wolverhampton. The Led Zeppelin deal with Atlantic Records on November 11, 1968 changed the music business forever. At the time of signing, their debut album was already fully recorded, so the label had no creative control over it, which was unheard of back then. The contract gave Jimmy Page Company, Super Hype Tapes Limited, the right to replace any band member except Page himself. Only Page signed the deal. The band got a 7.33% royalty rate in the US, Canada, and UK, and 5.5% in other countries. Atlantic could release 2 greatest hits albums a year, but the band had full control over tour dates, album design, release timing, and even which songs would be singles. They famously refused to release singles at all, breaking every industry rule. The band also created a unique album naming style, using Roman numerals. Their first album came out in January 1969, then Led Zeppelin II in October the same year, Led Zeppelin III in 1970, and the untitled Led Zeppelin IV in November 1971. That last one had no name or text on the cover, just 4 symbols. Atlantic Records hated the idea and warned it could kill their career, but Page refused to hand over the tapes until the label agreed. The record went on to become one of the best-selling albums in history. The Roman numeral idea influenced hundreds of bands later, with at least 665 metal albums using the numeral 3 alone. Jimmy Page also saw the rise of FM radio as a major opportunity. AM radio only played short songs, but FM was starting to air full album sides. Page recorded songs that flowed into each other, creating long listening experiences that fit perfectly with FM's style. Manager Peter Grant sent advance copies of their first album to FM stations in cities where they would tour, building excitement before the band even arrived. This helped make Stairway to Heaven the most requested FM radio song ever, even though it was never released as a single in the US. By 1973, they were breaking records once held by the Beatles. On May 4th in Atlanta, 49,000 people attended their show, far more than the Beatles' 33,000 record. The next day in Tampa, they drew 57,000 people, beating the Beatles' famous Shea Stadium crowd of 55,000. That show brought in $39,000, the most any rock concert had made at the time. In 1977 at the Pontiac Silverdome, they played for 76,000 fans and earned $642,000 in one night, a record for a single-act indoor concert. In the studio, Page recording techniques changed rock forever. Instead of placing microphones right in front of amps or isolating drums in dead rooms, he believed distance equals depth. He often put mics 20 feet away to capture the room's sound. He also used reverse echo, where the echo came before the main sound by flipping the tape during recording. He changed engineers for each album to make it clear the sound was his creation, not theirs. Outside music, Page became obsessed with occultist Aleister Crowley. In 1970, he bought Balkan House on the shores of Loch Ness, where Crowley had lived from 1899 to 1913. Page also collected Crowley's manuscripts, clothing, and other artifacts. He even had part of Crowley's famous motto carved into the groove of Led Zeppelin III. He owned a London mansion called the Tower House, long linked to paranormal stories, and an occult bookstore named after Crowley's journal, The Equinox. Page's shared interest in Crowley led to a friendship with filmmaker Kenneth Anger. In 1973, Anger performed an exorcism at Boleskine for Page. Page later let Anger use the basement of his London home to edit a Led Zeppelin concert film while working on Anger's movie Lucifer Rising. Their friendship collapsed in 1976 when Anger was thrown out of the house after giving strangers unauthorized tours. Anger then publicly insulted Page and claimed to put the curse of King Midas on him, saying it would freeze his career and turn his success into something lifeless. Some fans later linked Zeppelin's decline and Plant's misfortunes to this curse. Violence also marred the band's history. On July 23, 1977, at the Day on the Green Festival in Oakland, a fight broke out after a festival worker told Peter Grant's 10-year-old son not to remove a sign. Within minutes, John Bonham, Peter Grant, tour manager Richard Cole, and security man John Bindon were attacking security guard Jim Downey. Police later arrested all 4. They were charged with battery and each posted $250 bail. The arrests filmed for TV showed them being led into the station with coats over their heads while Grant shouted furiously. Jimmy Page's life in the 1970s was a mix of extraordinary music and deeply troubling stories. In June 1972, Jimmy Page was 28 years old when he met 14-year-old Laurie Maddox at the Hyatt House Hotel in Los Angeles during Led Zeppelin's North American tour. He first saw her by the pool and introduced himself simply as Jimmy. That night, the band's manager, Peter Grant, found her at the Rainbow Bar and Grill, put her in a limousine, and took her to Page's room. She later said this was the night she lost her virginity to him. At the time, California's age of consent was 18, making the relationship illegal. To keep it hidden, Grant often kept her locked in hotel rooms with security guards. Page would sometimes fly back to Los Angeles on Led Zeppelin's private jet just to see her and would call her daily from England. The relationship lasted over 2 years until 1975 when she was 16. It ended when she found him in bed with model Baby Bill. Many believe their time together inspired the Led Zeppelin song Sick Again, with its line about reaching 16. Charlotte Martin entered Page's life before that. Born Catherine Martin in Paris, she met him on his 26th birthday in January 1970 after a Royal Albert Hall gig. She had once dated Eric Clapton and briefly been with George Harrison. Page called her My Lady, and their daughter Scarlett was born on March 24, 1971. Charlotte had transformed herself from a strict Parisian upbringing into a free spirit, living among London's music and art scene. She stayed with Page for over a decade through Led Zeppelin's highest years before their separation in the early 1980s. Later, she became an artist, creating works about escaping her childhood and her links to 1960s culture. Page's destructive streak on tour became so bad that the crew sometimes chained him to toilets in hotel rooms. Groupies were left to watch him so he wouldn't wreck the place. His destruction wasn't small. He once threw televisions out of 5 different hotel rooms at Seattle's Edgewater Hotel in 1977. The band used fake names to book rooms because of their history. His behavior also included wearing Nazi uniforms and going to transvestite bars where he would take drugs with drag queens. Road manager Richard Cole said chaining him was sometimes the only way to have a quiet night. Pamela Des Barres, one of the most famous groupies of the era, said Page often wore Nazi outfits privately and publicly. In 1977, he even wore what he called a stormtrooper outfit on stage in Chicago, which looked a lot like a Nazi uniform. His trips to underground clubs continued, mixing with drug use and increasingly erratic behavior. The crew's restraints weren't just about property. They were trying to stop dangerous and damaging public scenes. In 1973, Page met filmmaker Kenneth Anger at a Sotheby's auction while bidding on Aleister Crowley items. They began working together on Anger's film Lucifer Rising. Page promised to compose the full soundtrack, but delivered only 20 minutes of music, far less than the 40 minutes needed. Anger later said Page was always on heroin and couldn't follow through. Their falling out turned bitter, with Anger claiming to put a curse on him. Around the same time, David Bowie became convinced Page was using black magic against him. Bowie's paranoia led him to draw pentagrams on his walls, keep bowls of urine around his house, and have his pool exorcised. On August 4, 1975, Robert Plant's family vacation in Rhodes turned into a disaster when their rental car crashed into a tree. Plant broke his ankle, foot bones, and elbow. His wife Maureen suffered a fractured skull, 4 broken pelvic bones, a shattered leg, and facial cuts. Their son Carrick broke his leg, and daughter Carmen broke her wrist. Medical care on the island was so poor that a private jet was sent to bring them back to London with doctors on board. Doctors even warned Plant he might not walk again. This accident forced the cancellation of their American tour, which had already sold 110,000 tickets for 2 Oakland Stadium shows. Many more stadium dates in Los Angeles, Kansas City, and other cities were also canceled. The loss was in the millions. It also disrupted the band's momentum, just as they had broken the Beatles' attendance record in 1973. In 1976, Kenneth Anger's curse story resurfaced. He claimed that Page's greed and unreliability would ruin everything he touched, like the mythical King Midas. Occult researchers later suggested this curse was part of the bad energy surrounding the band's tragedies. On July 26, 1977, Plant's 5-year-old son, Carrick, died suddenly from a stomach virus while the band was touring America. Plant was thousands of miles away. The grief was so deep that he considered leaving music altogether and even applied for a teaching job. He quit drugs that day and focused on his family. The loss inspired the song All My Love in 1979. The final blow came on September 25, 1980, when drummer John Bonham died after a day-long vodka binge. He had consumed around 40 shots within 24 hours. He choked on his vomit while sleeping at Page's house. Rather than replace him, Led Zeppelin announced on December 4, 1980 that they could not continue. Page later admitted that after losing Bonham, he didn't even want to touch a guitar for months. At the time, he was already deep into drug addiction. In the years that followed, Page searched for the spark he had lost. He formed the Fam in 1985 with Paul Rodgers from Bad Company, Tony Franklin, and Chris Slade. They released 2 albums, with Radioactive being the standout track, but the shadow of Zeppelin loomed large. In 1984, he joined Robert Plant, Jeff Beck, Nile Rodgers, and others in the Honey Drippers, which produced only 1 EP. His 1990s project with David Coverdale, known as Coverdale Page, was met with constant comparisons to Plant, who once mocked Coverdale's singing style. Each effort showed Page's skill, but the unique magic he had with Bonham was gone. During this time, Page married Patricia Ecker, a Louisiana model and waitress he met in 1986 while touring with the firm. They quickly fell in love, and Ecker moved to London with him. In April 1988, their son James Patrick Page III was born. The marriage gave Page some stability, but his work life remained unsettled. They divorced in January 1995 after nearly 9 years together. When Ecker died in October 2020, Page called her loss tragic and praised their son as strong and intelligent. Away from music, Page's interest in the occult only grew. He had bought Boleskine House in 1973, once owned by Aleister Crowley, a man infamous for his dark rituals. Stories about the house's haunted history dated back to the 10th century. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Page spent time there, knowing Crowley had once attempted a 6-month ritual meant to summon and control spirits, including Lucifer. Crowley never finished it, leaving the place supposedly cursed. Page also bought an occult-themed bookstore called the Equinox and the Tower House in London, another property linked to strange activity. By 1992, he sold Boleskine, saying the place had bad vibes. Buyers in 2015 and 2019 kept its eerie reputation alive. Page's creative block during this period was legendary, and some blamed filmmaker Kenneth Anger. They had met in 1973 when both were bidding on a Crowley manuscript. Anger convinced Page to score his film Lucifer Rising, but Page's drug problems and distractions meant it never happened. Anger, furious, cursed him, claiming it would destroy his creativity. Whether coincidence or not, Page's songwriting dried up for over a decade, and his later projects relied heavily on others for ideas. In the 1990s, Page's life began to take a different shape through his connection to Brazil. His charity work with Task Brazil in Action for Brazil's Children's Trust was so extensive that in 2005 he was named an officer of the Order of the British Empire and became an honorary citizen of Rio de Janeiro. He opened Casa Jimmy, a shelter for homeless youth, and built friendships with Brazilian musicians. When Led Zeppelin reunited for one night on December 10, 2007 at the O2 Arena, it became one of the biggest events in rock history. Over 20 million ticket requests came in online, a Guinness World Record. Tickets sold for $125 and all profits went to charity. Jason Bonham took his father's place on drums, creating an emotional moment for both the band and the fans. Page also shared his story in the 2008 documentary It Might Get Loud alongside The Edge and Jack White, and more recently in the 2025 film Becoming Led Zeppelin. That documentary showed never-seen footage from the band's rise in 1969 and 1970, earning a standing ovation at its Venice Film Festival preview. In 2014, Page began a relationship with poet Scarlett Sabat, who was 46 years younger than him. They collaborated creatively, producing her 2019 spoken word album, Catalyst. She has described him as a best friend, noting that their life together is quiet and private. Even after all these years, Page's reputation as one of the greatest guitarists has not faded. Rolling Stone ranked him third in their list of 100 greatest guitarists in both 2015 and 2023. He has been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice with the Yardbirds and Led Zeppelin and has received a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award. Through all the dark years, the reinventions and the controversies, his influence remains unshakable.